Neil adjusted his backpack and sighed as he entered the university's main hall. It was another normal day at Earth's first interstellar university, a place where humans and aliens study together. Well, normal was a strange word here. Walking through the halls, Neil passed students of all kinds, some with extra limbs, others with glowing eyes, and a few who communicated without speaking at all. The university had been established only a few years ago, a result of humanity's unexpected entry into the galactic community. At first, the other species thought humans were primitive, but after witnessing their adaptability, creativity, and sheer stubbornness, they quickly changed their minds. Now, Earth was one of the newest members of the Galactic Alliance, and human students were given the rare chance to study alongside alien minds from across the stars. Neil had never considered himself special. He was just an ordinary human student, studying engineering. However, his life took an interesting turn when he received a message from the university administration. "Dear Neil, you have been selected to assist an exchange student from the Selvar species. As a student of Earth, it is your responsibility to help them understand human culture and daily life." Neil had heard of the Selvar before. They were a reptilian-like species, covered in smooth scales, with sharp, angular features and glowing yellow eyes. Highly intelligent, the Selvar were known for their disciplined society, strict customs, and advanced technology. His assigned exchange student, Vezra, was one of only a few Selvar on Earth. Neil wasn't sure what to expect, but when he first met Vezra, she had been different from what he imagined. For one, she was always serious. She walked with perfect posture, her long coat flowing behind her like a royal robe. Unlike humans, Selvar rarely showed emotions on their faces, making it hard to tell what she was thinking. "Neil," she had greeted him with a slight nod, her voice smooth but firm. "I will be relying on your guidance." Neil had nodded back, trying not to seem nervous. Yeah, no problem." That was a few weeks ago. Since then, they had developed a strange but functional friendship. Neil helped Vezra understand human customs, how to use doors properly, the importance of small talk, and why humans laughed even when things weren't funny. In return, Vezra had amazed Neil with her intelligence. She could solve complex equations in seconds, analyze problems from angles he never considered, and had a memory that seemed almost perfect. But despite her brilliance, she struggled with basic human interactions. Why do humans ask, "How are you?" if they do not wish for a detailed answer? She had asked once, tilting her head in confusion. Neil had laughed. "It's just a polite way of starting a conversation. You don't actually have to explain how you're feeling." Vezra had blinked, processing the information. Illogical, but I will adapt. And she did. Slowly, she was getting better at human social habits, even if she still found some of them strange. But there was one thing about her that Neil found odd: her extreme need for privacy. Vezra never removed her coat in public, no matter how warm it was. Even when she worked in the lab, she kept her hands covered with gloves. When Neil asked about it, she simply replied, "Selvar culture requires modesty at all times." Neil didn't question it further. After all, every alien species had their own customs. He just assumed that was normal for the Selvar. That night, after a long study session, Neil returned to his dorm, exhausted. He dropped his bag on the floor and stretched. It had been a tough day, but at least he had no early classes tomorrow. Yawning, he moved to his closet and pulled off his shirt. He was about to grab a fresh one when suddenly, the door burst open. Neil froze. Standing in the doorway, staring at him, was Vezra. Her golden eyes went wide with shock, her posture stiff as if she had just seen something truly horrifying. Neil, completely caught off guard, could only stare back. A wave of awkward silence filled the room. Then, without a word, Vezra let out a sharp, panicked hiss, turned around, and bolted out of the room so fast that she almost tripped over her own feet. Neil blinked. What just happened? Neil stood frozen for several seconds, his brain struggling to process what had just happened. Vezra had walked into his room. She had seen him half-dressed, and then she had run out as if she had just witnessed the end of the universe. Finally, Neil shook himself out of his daze. What? He grabbed a shirt, pulled it on quickly, and rushed toward the door. By the time he stepped into the hallway, Vezra was gone. She had moved so fast that there wasn't even a trace of her. Neil sighed, rubbing his face. Great. Now she probably thinks I committed some horrible human crime. He considered going after her, but decided against it. If she had reacted that strongly, she probably needed time to calm down. The next morning, Neil spotted Vezra in the university cafeteria. She was sitting at her usual table, rigid as a statue, staring at nothing in particular. Taking a deep breath, Neil grabbed his tray and walked over. "Hey," he greeted, trying to sound normal. Vezra didn't respond. He sat down across from her. "So, about last night." "We shall never speak of it," Vezra interrupted stiffly, her gaze fixed on the table. Neil raised an eyebrow. Okay, but..." "Never," she repeated, her voice sharp. Neil sighed. "Look, Vezra, it's really not that big of a deal. It was just an accident." She finally turned to him, her golden eyes narrowing. "Not that big of a deal," she repeated, disbelief clear in her tone. "Neil, among my species, seeing another without their coverings is considered highly improper. It is an act of great dishonor." Neil blinked. "Wait, what?" Vezra hesitated, as if unsure whether to explain. But after a moment, she sighed and leaned forward slightly. "Among the Xelvar, we keep ourselves covered at all times in public. To expose oneself without reason is seen as a deep violation of personal dignity. It is only acceptable in the presence of one's closest family or lifelong bondmate." Neil's face turned red as he realized what she was implying. Wait. You mean..." "Yes," she said quickly, looking away. "In my culture, what happened last night would be something that only happens between deeply connected individuals, which we are not." Neil groaned, running a hand through his hair. "Okay, well, first of all, humans don't have that rule. I mean, sure, we usually wear clothes, but if someone accidentally walks in on someone changing, it's embarrassing, not a life-changing event." Vezra seemed skeptical. "Truly?" "Yeah," Neil assured her. "I mean, obviously, we don't just walk around naked in public, but seeing someone in a state of undress isn't that big of a deal. It's awkward, sure, but not some great offense." Vezra studied him carefully, as if trying to decide whether he was telling the truth. Finally, she sighed. "Your species continues to confuse me, Neil." He chuckled. "Yeah, well, the feeling's mutual." They sat in silence for a few moments. Then, hesitantly, Vezra spoke again. "I apologize for my reaction. I did not intend to offend you." Neil shook his head. "You didn't. If anything, I should have locked my door." She tilted her head. "Yes, you should have." Neil snorted. Okay, I get it." The tension between them slowly eased, though Vezra still seemed uncomfortable. Neil could tell that, even if she logically understood that it wasn't a big deal for humans, the situation still deeply unsettled her. Wanting to change the subject, Neil cleared his throat. "So, why did you come to my room in the first place?" Vezra stiffened slightly, as if just remembering why she had been there. She hesitated before answering. "I had a question regarding the upcoming exam. I thought it would be more efficient to ask in person." Neil smirked. "And instead, you got the biggest cultural shock of your life." "Yes," she muttered, clearly unamused. Neil chuckled. "Well, next time, maybe just knock first." Vezra exhaled slowly. "I will take that advice into consideration." Neil smiled, relieved that she seemed to be recovering from the incident. "Good. Now about that exam. What was your question?" She looked at him for a moment, then shook her head. "It does not matter. The experience erased all academic thoughts from my mind. Neil burst out laughing. Despite herself, Vezra's lips twitched slightly, as if fighting back a smile. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the disaster she had thought it was. Neil stretched his arms as he sat at his desk, flipping through his notes. The upcoming exam was going to be tough, and he needed to prepare. He glanced at his holoscreen, checking the time. 9:30 p.m. "All right, one more hour, then I'll call it a night," he muttered to himself. Across the room, his bed looked tempting, but he knew that if he lay down, he wouldn't get back up. With a sigh, he focused back on his notes. Meanwhile, in another part of the university, Vezra paced back and forth in her dorm. She had been staring at a particularly difficult equation for the past 30 minutes, but no matter how much she analyzed it, the solution wasn't coming to her. Her frustration grew. Back on Selvar, she never had trouble with studies. Logical thinking was one of her strongest skills. But human subjects were unpredictable. They required intuition, flexibility, and worst of all, creativity. She needed help. Immediately, she thought of Neil. He had been assisting her for weeks now, patiently explaining human concepts in a way she could understand. He would surely be able to clarify this problem for her. Without hesitation, she left her dorm and walked quickly to his room. Zelver did not have a habit of knocking on doors. Their doors functioned differently, opening automatically when detecting the presence of someone familiar. Vezra had noticed that human doors required a manual action, but it was an inefficient system. If she was expected in Neil's room, why would he not allow her to enter freely? With this reasoning, she placed her hand on the door handle and pushed it open. The moment she stepped inside, her brain froze. Neil stood in the middle of the room, wearing nothing but a towel slung loosely around his waist. His back was turned to her, muscles flexing slightly as he reached for a clean shirt. His wet hair dripped onto his shoulders, indicating he had just come out of the shower. Vezra's body locked up, her entire system going into alarm mode. Her mind screamed at her, but she was unable to react properly. He was uncovered. This was not supposed to happen. This was not supposed to happen. Her brain, usually sharp and logical, suddenly refused to function. This was the equivalent of seeing a high-ranking Selvar diplomat without their ceremonial robes. No, it was worse. It was like witnessing something so private that she wasn't even supposed to be aware it existed. She had to leave. Immediately. Her claws twitched as panic took over, but her legs wouldn't move. Neil, still unaware of her presence, finally grabbed his shirt and turned slightly, only to freeze mid-motion when he spotted her standing there. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. Silence. Awkward, unbearable silence. Neil's eyes widened in shock. Vezra. Vezra's survival instincts finally kicked in. With a sharp, panicked hiss, she spun on her heel and bolted out the door so fast that her coat barely kept up with her movements. Neil blinked as the door slammed shut behind her. The room was completely still again, except for the faint sound of hurried footsteps echoing down the hallway. Neil let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He ran a hand down his face, his mind catching up to what had just happened. What the heck was that? For a moment, he just stood there, trying to process the sheer awkwardness of the situation. Vezra had walked in, seen him in a towel, and had reacted like she had witnessed a galactic catastrophe. Neil exhaled, rubbing his temples. She's never gonna talk to me again, is she? Still, he couldn't help but chuckle at how over the top her reaction had been. He had known Vezra was serious about privacy, but this was on another level. Shaking his head, he finished getting dressed. He figured it was best to give her some time to recover from the trauma of seeing a half-dressed human. Meanwhile, Vezra had already made it back to her dorm. She shut the door behind her, locked it, and pressed her back against the wall, breathing heavily. Her mind raced. What had she done? What had she seen? Her face burned with embarrassment. If any other Xelvar had been in her position, they would have demanded an immediate honor reconciliation ritual. But Neil was human. Did humans even consider this an issue? She clenched her fists, trying to calm herself. She would have to face Neil eventually. He was her study partner, her guide in this strange human world. But how could she ever look at him the same way again? Her sharp claws tapped against her desk as she considered her options. One thing was clear: this would never happen again. Ever. Vezra spent the entire night sitting stiffly at her desk, her sharp claws tapping rhythmically against the metal surface. Her mind replayed the incident over and over, analyzing every detail like a broken recording. Why did I not knock? Why did I not turn away immediately? Why did I react like a frightened hatchling instead of a logical, disciplined Selvar scholar? Frustration boiled inside her. She was known for her calm, rational thinking. But in that moment, her mind had completely shut down. All because she had seen Neil in an unacceptable state of undress. Vezra exhaled sharply and stood up, pacing her small dorm. She needed a solution. The best course of action would be to never mention this again and avoid Neil entirely. Yes, that would be the safest option. But a small problem remained. Neil was her study partner. Avoiding him would mean falling behind in their shared assignments, which was unacceptable. Vezra clenched her fists. There was only one logical course of action. She would confront the issue head-on. She would find Neil and clarify that what happened was an accident and had no meaning in either of their cultures. With a deep breath, she grabbed her coat, wrapped it tightly around herself, and marched out of her dorm. Neil's morning. Neil, on the other hand, had woken up with a very different mindset. After last night's incident, he had initially thought Vezra would never speak to him again. But after some reflection, he realized that she was probably the one feeling the most awkward about it. If he acted normal, maybe she would too. So when he arrived at the cafeteria that morning and spotted Vezra approaching his table with her usual stiff posture, he decided to handle things with confidence. Morning, Neil greeted casually, taking a sip of his juice. "How's it going?" Vezra stopped in front of him, her golden eyes studying his face carefully. Neil could almost see the gears turning in her head. She was clearly trying to figure out how to begin. After a long pause, she finally spoke. "We must address the incident." Neil nearly choked on his drink. He had expected her to ignore it, not bring it up so directly. Still, he kept his expression neutral. What incident?" Vezra's eye twitched. "You know exactly which incident I am referring to." Neil scratched the back of his head, trying not to smirk. "Oh, that incident. You mean the part where you walked into my room without knocking?" Vezra straightened, as if insulted. "I was unaware that knocking was necessary when visiting a study partner." Neil raised an eyebrow. "So in Selvar culture, do you all just barge into each other's rooms unannounced?" She hesitated. "No, but I assumed I was welcome in your quarters." Neil chuckled. "Look, I get it. Different customs and all. But yeah, humans usually expect people to knock before entering, especially if the door is closed." Vezra absorbed this information, nodding slowly. "Understood. I will modify my behavior accordingly." Then, after a brief pause, she added, "And in return, you must ensure that you are appropriately covered at all times." Neil smirked. "I was covered. The towel counted." Vezra's tail flicked in irritation. A piece of cloth that could have fallen at any moment does not count as appropriate coverage. Neil laughed. Fine. I promise to be fully dressed if I ever expect you to come barging in again." Vezra exhaled, her tense shoulders relaxing slightly. "Good. Then we are in agreement." Neil leaned back in his chair, smiling. "See, that wasn't so hard." Vezra gave him a sharp look. This was incredibly difficult. Neil grinned. "You're doing great." She didn't respond immediately, but something in her expression softened. After a moment, she sat down across from him, folding her hands on the table. "We have an exam to prepare for." Neil took another sip of his juice. Yep, and now that we've solved this crisis, we can actually focus on studying. Vezra nodded. Agreed. As they opened their notes and began reviewing material, Neil couldn't help but feel amused. Despite the awkwardness, despite the incident, their friendship was still intact. And honestly, he wouldn't have it any other way. Neil leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms above his head. He had spent the last hour going over study notes with Vezra, but his brain was starting to slow down. All right, I think we've covered enough for today, he said, rubbing his eyes. Vezra, seated across from him, barely looked up from her holo tablet. We still have much to review. Human history is unnecessarily complex. Neil chuckled. Yeah, I get that a lot. Too many wars, too many names, and way too many betrayals. Vezra frowned. Your species seems to enjoy conflict. Neil shrugged. Not enjoy exactly. We just have a history of overcoming struggles. He smirked. And we always come out stronger in the end. Vezra tilted her head slightly. That is an admirable trait. Neil grinned. Thanks. But right now my brain is on strike. We need a break. Vezra hesitated. A break. Neil nodded. Yeah, doing something other than studying for a little while. Helps keep the mind fresh. Vezra tapped her claws against the table, thinking. What do humans do during breaks? Neil smirked. Lots of things. We play games, watch movies, go for walks. He thought for a moment before an idea popped into his head. Actually, I know something that might be fun. Vezra raised an eyebrow. Fun. Neil stood up, stretching. Yeah, come on. We're going to the recreation center. A new experience. The university's recreation center was a large facility filled with various activities, sports courts, exercise rooms, and even virtual reality simulators. Neil had been here plenty of times, but he had never seen Excelvar inside before. Vezra followed him inside, her sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. What is the purpose of this place? Neil grinned. Humans like to stay active. It helps relieve stress. Vezra looked skeptical. And how does one relieve stress here? Neil gestured toward a section, with a few students playing a simple game with a ball. That's called table tennis. Easy to learn. Good reflex training. Vezra observed the fast-paced game. It appears inefficient. The ball is simply being struck back and forth. Neil smirked. That's the point. Come on, I'll show you. They walked over to an empty table, and Neil grabbed 2 paddles, handing one to Vezra. All right, it's simple. You hit the ball to me, I hit it back to you. Try to keep it going. Vezra held the paddle uncertainly. And the objective? Neil shrugged. Just don't miss. She narrowed her eyes. Very well. Neil served the ball lightly toward her. Vezra reacted fast. Too fast. She swung with perfect precision, sending the ball flying across the room at an alarming speed. Neil's eyes widened as he heard the ball smack against the far wall. Vezra straightened. I have succeeded. Neil laughed. But not exactly. You're supposed to keep the ball on the table. Vezra frowned. Why limit the range? Neil grinned. Because that's what makes it a game. She studied the table thoughtfully. I see. I will adjust my approach. They played a few more rounds, and Vezra quickly learned to control her strength. Neil was impressed. Her reflexes were incredible, and she rarely missed a shot. Finally, after several intense volleys, Neil missed, and the ball rolled off the table. Vezra placed her paddle down. I have won. Neil wiped his forehead dramatically. Man, remind me not to challenge Excelvar to a reflex game. Vezra gave him a small, satisfied nod. This was enjoyable. Neil grinned. See, I told you taking a break was a good idea. Vezra glanced around the recreation center again. Are there other human activities you believe I should experience? Neil chuckled. Oh, definitely, but one step at a time. Vezra. As they walked out of the facility, Neil couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. Vezra was opening up, little by little. Maybe, just maybe, their friendship was becoming something stronger than just a study partnership. And honestly, he liked the sound of that. Neil and Vezra walked out of the recreation center, the cool evening air brushing against them. The human campus was still active, with students moving around in groups, laughing, talking, and enjoying their break from studies. Vezra observed them quietly. She had always been fascinated by how humans interacted. Their emotions were so open. Their facial expressions, their body movements, it was all so expressive. Neil stretched his arms, grinning. Well, that was fun. I gotta say, you're a natural at table tennis. Vezra tilted her head. It was a simple game of reflex and precision. There was no complexity in strategy. Neil chuckled. You just described half of human sports. Vezra considered his words. And yet you find great enjoyment in them. Neil nodded. It's not just about winning. It's about the experience, the challenge, the movement, the fun of competing. Vezra tapped a claw against her arm thoughtfully. Interesting. They continued walking, passing by the university's central plaza. A group of students was gathered near a large display screen, watching something with excitement. Laughter and cheers filled the air. Neil glanced at them and smirked. Looks like a movie night. Vezra looked at him curiously. Movie? Neil's eyes widened. Wait, you've never watched a movie before? Vezra shook her head. I have read human literature, but I have not engaged in your visual storytelling. Neil grinned. Oh, we have to change that. A movie experience. Minutes later, Neil and Vezra found themselves sitting on a grassy patch near the large screen. The students had set up an open-air movie night, and many were gathered around with snacks and drinks. Vezra observed her surroundings. Humans seemed to enjoy gathering in groups for entertainment. Neil nodded. Yeah, watching a movie alone is fine, but watching it with others makes it better. Reactions, discussions, shared emotions, it makes the experience more fun. Vezra filed this information away. Humans find value in shared experiences. The movie began, and Vezra focused on the screen. It was an action film, fast-paced, filled with dramatic music, explosions, and heroic dialogue. Vezra watched with curiosity as the protagonist, a human soldier, fought against overwhelming odds to save his people. His courage, determination, and willingness to sacrifice himself for others fascinated her. She leaned toward Neil slightly. Is this based on true events? Neil chuckled. Not exactly, but the themes are real. Humans love stories about heroism and survival. Vezra nodded. She understood now. Humans were drawn to tales of struggle because they themselves had endured countless struggles in their history. As the movie reached its climax, the protagonist stood alone against an unstoppable enemy. The tension built up. The music swelled. Then, suddenly, the hero was struck down. Vezra tensed. He lost. The screen showed the hero, lying on the ground, breathing heavily. His strength was fading. The enemy stood over him, victorious. A strange, uncomfortable feeling settled in Vezra's chest, something she had never felt before. She didn't like this. She turned slightly toward Neil. This outcome is unacceptable. Neil raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Vezra's claws tightened. He cannot die. He has fought too hard. He must win. Neil smiled a little. You're invested in the story, huh? Vezra didn't respond. She simply turned back to the screen, her golden eyes sharp with intensity. Then, just as all hope seemed lost, the hero found one last surge of strength. He rose to his feet, delivering a final, decisive strike. The enemy was defeated. The music swelled triumphantly. The crowd cheered, and Vezra felt relief. She exhaled slowly, releasing a tension she hadn't even realized she was holding. Neil noticed. See, that's the magic of movies. Vezra was silent for a moment. Then she said softly, I experienced an unfamiliar emotion. Neil looked at her curiously. What kind of emotion? Vezra hesitated. When it appeared that the hero would lose, I felt displeased. I did not wish to see him fail. Neil smiled. That's called empathy. You connected with the character, and you didn't want him to suffer. Vezra considered his words carefully. Empathy. Zelvar were not known for such emotions. Their culture valued logic, order, and strength. But here she was, affected by a fictional human story. This realization unsettled her, but also intrigued her. Neil grinned. So, did you enjoy your first movie? Vezra looked at the screen as the credits rolled. Then, slowly, she nodded. Yes, I did. Neil leaned back, satisfied. Told you. As the crowd dispersed, Vezra glanced at Neil, a question forming in her mind. Would you show me more of these stories? Neil blinked, then laughed. Oh, Vezra, you have no idea what you've just signed up for. And for the first time, Vezra allowed herself a small, bemused smile. Vezra had always believed she understood the universe, that Zelvar were logical beings, advanced in knowledge and discipline. They valued efficiency, control, and order, but ever since she met Neil, she had begun to question things she had never considered before. Her experiences with him, studying together, competing in human games, and now watching their emotional stories, had made her aware of something new. Human connections were different, and she was beginning to understand why. A change in routine. The next morning, Vezra arrived at their usual study area, expecting to see Neil already waiting. He was always punctual, sometimes even arriving before her. But today, his seat was empty. She frowned. It was not like him to be late. Minutes passed, then an hour. Still no sign of Neil. Vezra's tail flicked in irritation. Did he forget our schedule? No, that was unlikely. Neil was sometimes careless in small matters, but when it came to studying together, he never failed to show up. Something was wrong. Vezra closed her holo tablet and stood up. If Neil was not here, she would go find him. An unwell human. Vezra found Neil in his dormitory, lying in bed, looking unusually pale. He blinked groggily when she entered. Vezra, you failed to arrive at our study session, she stated bluntly. Neil groaned, shifting slightly under his blanket. Yeah, sorry about that. Not feeling great today. Vezra stepped closer, analyzing him. His skin temperature seemed higher than usual, his breathing was slower, and his voice was weaker. You are ill, she observed. Neil sighed. Yeah, just a fever. Nothing serious. Vezra frowned. A fever. Neil waved a weak hand. It's normal. Humans get sick sometimes. Our immune systems fight it off, and we recover. Vezra stared at him. You have an advanced civilization, yet your bodies still fail against small biological threats. Neil smirked weakly. Yep. Welcome to human biology. Vezra hesitated, then asked, Have you taken the proper medication? Neil nodded. Yeah, just need rest. She stood by his bedside for a moment, unsure of what to do. Zelvar were not raised to show concern. They valued self-reliance. If one was weak, they simply endured it. But humans, they were different. Neil, despite his weakness, still tried to smile. You didn't have to check on me, you know. Vezra crossed her arms. You are my study partner. If you are unable to function, I am affected as well. Neil chuckled softly. So you're saying you only came here because it's inconvenient for you if I'm sick? Vezra paused, then looked away. That is, not entirely true. Neil watched her curiously. You care? She stiffened. I did not say that. But you do, Neil teased, his grin widening. Vezra's tail flicked in mild annoyance. You are insufferable even in sickness. Neil laughed weakly. I'll take that as a yes. She sighed. You require rest. I will leave. But as she turned to go, she hesitated. Then, in a rare moment of uncertainty, she spoke again. If you require assistance, contact me. Neil looked at her, surprised. Then he smiled softly. Thanks, Vezra. She gave a small nod and left the room. A new understanding. As she walked back to her dorm, Vezra felt strange. Checking on a sick human should not have been important. It should not have mattered. But it did. And she was beginning to understand why. Humans did not see bonds as obligations or logical arrangements. They cared for one another because they chose to. Their friendships were not based on usefulness, but on connection. It was an alien concept to her. And yet, as she thought about Neil's tired but grateful smile, she realized something. She did not just see Neil as a study partner. He was becoming something more. And for the first time, Vezra was starting to understand what it truly meant to have a friend. Vezra sat in the university library, her sharp golden eyes scanning her holo-tablet. The information was clear, the equations precise, and the logic sound. Yet, something felt incomplete. She tapped her claws against the table, distracted. It had been 2 days since Neil had fallen sick, and though she had checked on him briefly, she had not visited again. Why does it bother me? She wondered. Selvar did not form unnecessary attachments. Their culture valued discipline, independence, and self-sufficiency. Yet when Neil had smiled at her, weak but grateful, she had felt something different. A sense of connection. She was still thinking about this when she heard a familiar voice behind her. Missed me? Vezra turned. Neil stood there, looking healthier but slightly tired. His usual grin was back, though his movements were slower than usual. You are recovered, she observed. Neil shrugged. Mostly. Still a little weak, but nothing serious. Vezra studied him carefully. You should still be resting. Neil chuckled as he sat down across from her. If I rest too much, I'll fall behind in class, and I figured you'd be waiting for me. Vezra hesitated, then looked down at her holo-tablet. I continued studying in your absence. Neil smirked. Of course you did. There was a brief silence before he spoke again, this time more softly. Thanks for checking on me, by the way. Vezra did not respond immediately. Instead, she simply nodded. Neil smiled. You know, you're different from most Selvar I've met. Vezra looked at him. In what way? Well, for starters, you actually care. Vezra frowned slightly. Selvar care about the well-being of their people. Yeah, but humans care differently, Neil said. We don't just look after each other because it's logical. We do it because we want to. Vezra considered his words. She had already noticed this about humans, how they formed friendships not based on efficiency, but on something deeper. Something that she was still struggling to understand. An unexpected challenge. Before she could respond, a loud voice interrupted them. Well, if it isn't our human expert on aliens. Neil sighed, his expression shifting. Vezra turned to see 3 human students approaching their table. They were not from their class, but Vezra had seen them around campus before. Neil forced a smile. What do you want, Greg? The leader, a tall student with short brown hair, smirked. Just wondering why you're always hanging around the Selvar. Getting tired of your own species. Vezra immediately sensed the tension in Neil's posture. She studied the humans. Their body language was not aggressive, but their tone suggested mockery. Neil crossed his arms. Vezra's my friend. That a problem for you? Greg chuckled. Friend? That's rich. You really think an alien sees you as an equal? Vezra's eyes narrowed. Greg turned toward her. Tell me, Selvar, do you actually see this guy as a friend? Or is he just a study tool for you? Vezra's tail flicked slightly. She did not like this human's tone. Neil stood up. All right, we're done here. Greg smirked. Relax, I was just asking a question. You know, Some people think humans shouldn't be so friendly with aliens. They think we should stick to our own kind. Neil's jaw clenched. Yeah, well, I think those people are idiots. Greg's smirk faded slightly. Vezra observed the exchange carefully. She understood now. This was not just teasing. It was a challenge, a test of loyalty. She slowly stood up as well. Neil is correct. You are an idiot. Greg blinked, surprised by her direct words. Neil let out a short laugh. Told you. Greg scoffed. Whatever. Have fun with your alien friend. He and his group walked away. Vezra turned to Neil. Do many humans think as he does? Neil sighed. Some, not all. But yeah, there are people who don't trust aliens. They think we should stay separate. Vezra studied him. And you disagree? Neil met her gaze. Of course I do. I mean, look at us. We're from completely different species, but we get along just fine. If more people thought like that, the universe would be a better place. Vezra considered his words carefully. Neil's belief in trust and unity was not logical from a Selvar perspective, but it was admirable. And for the first time, Vezra felt certain of something. She did not just respect Neil. She trusted him. And that, she realized, was something far more valuable than logic. The next few days passed in an unusual way for Vezra. Ever since the incident with Greg, she had been thinking about something new. Trust. She had always believed that relationships were built on usefulness and logic. But Neil had shown her something different. Trust was not about necessity. It was about choice. And she had chosen to trust him. Now she wanted to understand why. A quiet evening. Neil and Vezra sat on the rooftop of the university dormitory, looking at the vast night sky. The stars above shimmered brightly, some of them belonging to human space, others to alien civilizations. Neil stretched his arms, sighing. You know, I never get tired of this view. Vezra glanced at him. You see stars every night. Why does it still interest you? Neil smirked. Because it reminds me how small we are compared to the universe, but also how much we've accomplished. Vezra followed his gaze. That Selvar had long conquered space, yet they had never looked at the stars the way humans did. To them, the cosmos was something to control. But to humans, it was something to explore. Neil leaned back on his elbows. You've been quiet today. Something on your mind. Vezra hesitated for a moment. Then she spoke. You trust me. Neil blinked, surprised. Yeah. Why? That is what I am trying to understand. Vezra admitted. Trust is not logical. It is not guaranteed. Yet you gave it to me. Neil chuckled. That's what friends do. Vezra's tail flicked. But why? You had no reason to. I could have been untrustworthy. Neil smiled. Maybe. But trust isn't about knowing someone will never betray you. It's about believing they won't. Vezra considered this carefully. It was different from how Selvar thought. To them, trust was earned through logic and reliability. But humans, they gave trust before proof. And somehow, that made it more valuable. Neil sat up. Let me ask you something. Do you trust me? Vezra looked at him for a long moment. Then slowly she nodded. Yes. Neil grinned. Then you get it. Vezra tilted her head. Perhaps I do. An unspoken understanding. For a while, they simply sat in silence, enjoying the cool air. The sounds of the university were distant, leaving only the quiet hum of the night around them. Then Neil chuckled. You know, if someone had told me months ago that my best friend would be a Selvar, I would have laughed. Vezra raised an eyebrow. And now? Neil smiled. Now, I wouldn't trade it for anything. Something shifted inside Vezra at those words, a warmth she did not fully understand. She had spent her entire life believing that Selvar were superior, that emotions were secondary to logic. But now, sitting beside a human who had taught her trust, she realized something. She had changed. And she did not regret it. Neil nudged her shoulder playfully. Admit it, you're glad you met me. Vezra rolled her eyes. You are insufferable. Neil laughed. That wasn't a no. Vezra sighed but allowed herself a small smile. Maybe trust was not logical. Maybe humans were strange. But maybe, just maybe, that was what made them special. The end.